Conservationists say decades of efforts to save the European bison are proving successful. According to the latest update of the official extinction list,
in the remote mountains of southern Romania, the forest was in trouble. After centuries of logging, farming, and hunting, the land had been stripped bare. Wildlife disappeared, meadows crumbled, and a once lively ecosystem turned into a quiet, empty place.
Forests used to look like this, but now they look like this.
Then, in 2014, a group of conservationists took a big chance. They brought back a herd of European bison, animals that hadn't been seen there in more than 200 years. A lot of people thought it wouldn't work. Bison are huge and can be rough on the land. The area was tough, wild, and full of challenges. Even experts weren't sure it could succeed. But they went ahead anyway. And just 1 year later, something happened that nobody expected. What came next changed how people thought about rewilding for good. The slow collapse of a giant.
This is the mighty European bison, the largest land mammal on the continent, and it's now back in...
Long before cities covered the land, European bison, also called wisent, roamed freely from the forests of France to the Caucasus Mountains. These massive animals played a big role in shaping Europe's natural spaces. They wandered through woodlands and grasslands, spreading seeds and changing the land as they moved. But their time at the top didn't last. Their fall wasn't sudden. It happened little by little, over hundreds of years, as humans changed the land and pushed nature aside. By the Middle Ages, farming had already squeezed bison into smaller, scattered wild areas. Forests were cut down to make room for crops and homes, and the bison lost the wide spaces they needed to survive. It wasn't just a local problem. It happened across the continent. As habitats broke apart, many big animals had nowhere left to go. Still, the bison hung on, making do with shrinking forests and holding out in places not yet touched by the axe. The Industrial Revolution didn't just bring machines and factories, it also brought rifles, tools that gave people a huge edge over wildlife. Hunting bison used to take skill and teamwork. Now it took just one shot. By the 18th and 19th centuries, as guns spread through Europe, bison numbers dropped even more. People hunted them for meat, hides, and sometimes just to show off. Nobles and soldiers wanted trophies. The last wild herds became easy targets. Then came World War I, and with it, the worst blow yet. As countries clashed, nature paid the price too. In Poland's Białowieża forest, the last big group of wild bison lived, but the forest became a war zone. German soldiers, desperate for food and resources, wiped out nearly every bison there. By the end of the war, just 9 were left, and they didn't make it through the chaos that followed. By 1927, the unthinkable happened. European bison were gone from the wild. Only 54 remained, all in zoos or private enclosures. In the stillness they left behind, a question started to grow. Could these few surviving bison, descendants of a lost wilderness, help bring that wilderness back? The hidden bloodline. How scientists rescued the European bison. After the last wild European bison was killed in 1927, the species stood on the edge of total extinction. The only bison left were those living in captivity, mostly in zoos and a handful of private reserves. Just 54 animals remained, and of those, only 12 had the strong genetics needed to rebuild the species. These bison had been taken from their natural world, and no one knew if they could ever make it back. Still, scientists felt it was worth trying. Even in such a fragile state, saving them mattered. In the early 1930s, conservationists began carefully planned breeding programs in places like Poland, Germany, and Russia. With so few bison left, every birth was a big deal, and each animal had to be closely monitored. Breeders kept detailed records to avoid inbreeding and to help the animals stay as healthy as possible. This kind of careful planning was one of the first of its kind in Europe, and it became a model for future species recovery efforts. In 1932, there was a major breakthrough, the founding of the International Society for the Protection of the European Bison. This group brought together scientists, vets, and conservationists from different countries. Even with Europe divided by political tensions, especially during and after World War II, the mission stayed focused. Their goal was simple but vital: protect the bison, grow their numbers, and keep their genetics as diverse as possible. By the 1960s and 70s, the captive population had slowly grown. Bison were now living in large forest parks, fenced reserves, and nature centers. But as the numbers rose, so did a bigger question: could these animals ever return to the wild? And if they could, what impact would they have on Europe's damaged landscapes? That question became more important as scientists began to realize just how connected bison were to the land itself. European bison aren't just big animals, they're a keystone species. That means their daily habits help shape the entire environment. As they roam, bison graze on grasses and shrubs, open up tangled areas, carry seeds in their fur and droppings, and fertilize the ground as they go. Their presence helps support everything from wildflowers and insects to birds and small mammals. Without them, many parts of Europe's forests and meadows had started to fade. Thick brush blocked out sunlight, wildflowers vanished, and pollinators lost their homes. The land had grown quiet and still, no longer alive in the way it once was. That's when a new idea started to grow. What if the bison weren't meant to be kept behind fences? What if they were brought back to help nature heal itself? That became the heart of rewilding. The bison's role was no longer just about saving a species, it was about restoring life to the land. Releasing bison into Europe's wilderness desert. For years, scientists had worked to protect European bison in captivity, but by the early 2000s it was clear that keeping them behind fences wasn't enough. The next step was rewilding, returning bison to the wild places they once roamed and giving them the chance to live freely again. It was a bold move. Rewilding would test not just if the bison could survive, but whether they could help bring Europe's worn-out landscapes back to life. No country took this challenge more seriously than Romania. At the center of the plan was a remote and wild area called the Țarcu Mountains, part of the southern Carpathians in western Romania. This region had once been home to wild bison, but for over 200 years none had roamed its hills. Though still rich in wildlife, the area had been heavily damaged by people. Overgrazing, illegal logging, and the collapse of traditional farming had left large patches of worn-out land. Meadows had turned to thickets, forests lost their natural balance, and native species were fading. In many ways, it had become what conservationists called a wilderness desert, a place that looked wild but no longer worked like a healthy ecosystem. Some locals even called it the dying forest. Rewilding Europe, a non-profit dedicated to restoring nature across the continent, teamed up with WWF Romania to try something never done before on this scale. They picked the Țarcu Mountains for the biggest wild bison reintroduction project in Europe. The goal wasn't just to bring back the bison, but to let them help fix the land. If it worked, it would show the world how rewilding could undo some of the deep damage left by centuries of human activity. But this wasn't a simple release. The terrain was tough, remote, mountainous, and lacking basic infrastructure. There were no fences, barely any paved roads, and limited access to vets. The nearby villages, while rich in heritage, hadn't lived near wild bison for generations. Some people were worried. They feared the animals might ruin crops, cause harm, or compete with their livestock. Others weren't sure it was safe, or even possible, to let such big animals roam free again. Doubt was everywhere, from village streets to scientific circles. Even experts weren't sure how things would play out. Would the bison settle in? Would they wander too far? Could the land actually support them? Or would the herd struggle and fade? And with so little genetic variety to work with, any mistake could set the effort back by years. Still, the mission remained. If bison could return and thrive, they might help bring the Carpathians back to life. But vision alone wasn't enough. What came next would be the hardest part, making it all actually happen. Dreaming was one thing, doing it was another. Making a real living herd meant solving one problem after another, often with no clear roadmap. How rewilding teams brought bison. Back to Romania, making rewilding real took more than just dropping animals into the mountains. It took years of preparation, teamwork across countries, and careful planning to bring bison back to the southern Carpathians. The people behind it had to think like vets, engineers, and community leaders, all at once. Every piece mattered, from keeping the bison healthy to helping them adjust to a brand new home. The first step was choosing the right bison. Rewilding Europe and WWF Romania worked with breeding centers and wildlife parks across the continent to find animals with strong genetics. Bison were brought in from countries like Sweden, Germany, Poland, and Italy, sometimes traveling for days by truck. Before the journey, each animal was checked by veterinarians to make sure they were healthy and fit enough to handle the stress of travel. Moving a 1,900-pound bison isn't easy. They had to be carefully loaded into special transport crates, given rest breaks, and watched closely for any signs of distress. Once they arrived in Romania, the bison weren't released right away. Instead, they were placed in soft-release enclosures, large fenced areas where they could slowly adjust to the local weather, landscape, and food. This period of transition was key. It gave the bison time to settle in and allowed scientists to study their behavior and health. Before release, each bison was fitted with a GPS collar. These devices were vital for tracking their movements, mapping their range, and making sure they stayed away from roads or villages. Using satellite data, monitoring teams kept an eye on where the animals went, what they ate, and how they were doing. Trained field rangers recorded details like herd behavior, feeding routines, and signs of illness or stress. Another important part of the plan was involving the local community. To build trust, the rewilding team worked hand-in-hand with nearby villages, offering jobs as rangers, wildlife trackers, and guides. They held school visits, public talks, and invited people to learn more about the bison. Local knowledge about the land and the seasons turned out to be a huge help. Over time, many villagers began to feel proud of the animals and saw them as a possible way to attract visitors and new income. The first official release happened in May 2014. 17 bison stepped onto wild Romanian ground for the first time in over 2 centuries. It was a proud moment, but one filled with questions. Would the bison adjust? Would the land respond? Could this hopeful plan stand up to real-world challenges? At first, results were mixed. Some bison had trouble adjusting, others did well. A second group was released in 2015, and the work moved ahead with care. The foundation had been laid, but no one could say for sure what would happen next. Even with solid planning, nature doesn't always follow the script. Setbacks, skeptics, and a faint light of hope. Although the Reintroduction project began with care and hope, the early years were anything but easy. Once the bison were released, theory collided with reality. And reality was tough. Life in the Carpathians wasn't guaranteed, and neither was the support of the public. Behind the headlines and powerful images of bison returning to the wild, there were struggles, quiet doubts, and growing pressure to prove that rewilding was more than just a nice idea. The problems started almost right away. Some bison didn't survive the adjustment period. Stress from long travel, strange terrain, and unfamiliar food led to health issues, and in some cases, deaths. These early losses made some people wonder if the Tsarku Mountains could truly support a free-roaming herd. The area's broken-up landscape, cut through by old roads, scattered farms, and changing weather patterns, created constant challenges for animals that hadn't grown up in the wild. On top of that, technical problems began to add stress. The GPS collars, which were key to tracking the herd, started to fail in some cases. Signals dropped, batteries ran out, and some collars just stopped working. This made it harder for rangers to keep tabs on the bison and respond quickly if something went wrong. With less information coming in, it became difficult for scientists to tell whether the bison were settling in or struggling. Skepticism in nearby communities also grew. Some locals were already worried about how the bison might affect their fields or animals, and concerns only got worse when reports came in of bison roaming close to villages. Stories started to spread, some stretched, some just plain false, about the animals breaking fences or threatening farms. The Rewilding team kept working to connect with the community, holding talks and sharing updates, but not everyone was reassured. Fear and rumors often spread faster than facts. Then funding started to wobble. A project this big needed ongoing support, but as early issues added up, some donors and partners began to pull back. Conservationists worried that delays, or worse, cuts, could stop the progress before the herd had a chance to truly settle. Patience was running low in some corners, and doubts started to grow about whether the project was practical or even safe. And yet, in the middle of all the tension, something began to shift. In late 2015, field teams started to notice surprising signs. The bison were beginning to stabilize. They were sticking together, foraging in groups, and showing the early signs of adaptation. Then came a moment that no one dared to expect. Rangers spotted a pregnant female. It didn't seem real. No wild bison had been born here in more than 200 years. Many had feared the animals wouldn't last long, wouldn't adjust, and certainly wouldn't reproduce under pressure. Some even believed life in captivity had taken away their instincts. But 1 year later, the impossible happened. A wild calf was born in the Carpathians. That little calf was more than just a success. It felt like a small miracle. And once the news spread, even the harshest critics grew quiet. The herd grows. What happened in the months and years after that birth was a steady change. The herd began to grow, not just in numbers, but in strength and stability. Starting in 2016, more bison were released into the wild every year. These animals, selected for their genetic variety, came from breeding centers across Europe to help strengthen the population and encourage natural herd behaviors. But more than the new arrivals, it was the wild-born bison that showed the most promise. They started forming social bonds, building routines, and moving together across wide areas of land. These patterns were critical, not just for survival, but for proving the bison were doing more than adjusting. They were reclaiming their space. Technology confirmed what people on the ground were seeing. The GPS data showed the bison moving more confidently, covering more ground, and using ancient grazing paths. Instead of circling around their release zones or sticking to easy routes, they were spreading out with purpose, following rhythms that matched those of their ancestors. And then came another sign of real recovery. As the seasons passed, dominant males began to compete during mating time, just as they would have done centuries ago. The females began to group together for protection, while the calves quickly picked up survival skills by staying close to their mothers. Surprisingly, the number of calves that made it through their first year was higher than expected. With each passing spring, more young bison were seen. By the end of 2017, the herd no longer consisted only of released animals. Wild-born bison were now a growing part of the population. Thanks to ongoing monitoring and smart genetic management, diversity stayed strong. Even experts who had doubted the project at first started to change their view. What once looked like an overly ambitious idea was now proving its value in real time. The herd was steady, new births were happening, and the land was beginning to respond. Some of the most cautious voices in conservation began calling it one of the most hopeful rewilding stories in Europe. And yet, while the growing herd was a victory on its own, something even bigger and less measurable was beginning to take place. Something that couldn't be tracked with a GPS or fully captured in data. Nature responds. The forest floor comes back to life. As the bison made their home deeper into the wild hills of the southern Carpathians, something remarkable started to happen. It wasn't just that the animals had survived, it was that the land itself, long worn down and missing its natural balance, had started to come alive again. At first, the changes were slow, then they became impossible to ignore. Bison are more than grazers, they're natural builders of ecosystems. Every step they take, eating, walking, rolling in the dirt, shapes the world around them. Conservationists had always believed this in theory, but few expected to see such dramatic change so quickly. Many still asked, could a few dozen animals really make a difference in such a large landscape? Could they actually help more than they hurt? The answers started to show up in the ground itself. Camera traps and drone images picked up early clues. Dense brush gave way to small, open patches where sunlight could reach the soil again. These gaps allowed native flowers, herbs, and grasses to grow where there had once been little variety. The bison's hooves broke up the packed earth, letting air and water move more freely to the roots below. When they rolled or wallowed, they unintentionally created perfect seed beds, sometimes even spreading seeds stuck to their coats or dropped in their waste. Before long, scientists noticed a clear increase in plant diversity. Botanists recorded native species growing in places once taken over by just one or two kinds of grass or thick invasive shrubs. Ground-nesting birds like the Eurasian woodlark and tawny pipit came back, drawn by the new open meadows. Pollinators followed, filling the air with motion and sound. Small mammals like foxes and hares returned, foraging in the bison-cleared spaces. And with them came bigger predators. Sightings of wolves and lynx began to rise. Soil tests confirmed what could now be seen: better structure, more organic matter, and improved carbon storage. Water ran off more slowly during rains, reducing erosion. Even local climate patterns in certain valleys showed slight improvements thanks to the new layers of plant cover. What shocked everyone wasn't just the recovery, it was how fast it was happening. Only a few years earlier, this land had been written off as a dying forest, stripped of the animals and balance it once had. Now, with bison back where they belonged, the Carpathians were clearly coming back to life. Locals who had once been nervous about damage or danger were now the ones sharing stories of beauty. Meadows blooming with color, birdsong returning to places that had been silent, and peaceful sightings of calves grazing beside their mothers. Communities that had once been unsure were now beginning to feel proud. What started as a bold and risky idea had turned into clear, visible proof. The bison hadn't just made it, they had brought the wild back with them. And still, this was only the beginning. In the years that followed, what began as a hopeful experiment turned into real, lasting progress. As the Southern Carpathians grew into Europe's most successful bison rewilding effort, something bigger began to take shape. The wild was spreading. By 2022, with the ecosystem bouncing back and the herd thriving, the rewilding project reached a major turning point. What once seemed like a long shot had become a global example of how, with time and the right support, nature can find its way back. And the changes weren't just about flowers blooming or animals returning. The future of the entire European bison species took a major step forward. That year, scientists ran a detailed genetic study on the Romanian herd, comparing wild-born bison to those brought in from breeding centers. The results were incredible. Genetic diversity, once the species' biggest weakness, had begun to stabilize. Inbreeding rates were going down, and the herd's gene pool was getting stronger. What was once a dependent population was now self-sustaining. The wild wasn't just a home anymore, it had become a starting point for something new. This success marked the beginning of a new phase. In 2023, Rewilding Europe and WWF Romania shifted their focus from simply increasing numbers to growing territory and linking habitats. With more people supporting the effort, the project grew broader and deeper. Between 2023 and 2024, over 11 calves were born in the wild, and more than half the herd was now made up of wild-born bison. Just a few years earlier, this milestone had felt far off, something for the distant future. Now, the herd was no longer being managed just to survive. It was thriving on its own. At the same time, the bison's territory was spreading fast. From their original release zones, they began exploring nearby valleys and forests. By mid-2024, they were moving across over 370 square kilometers. In September 2023, camera traps captured images of bison inside Dolmogled Valea Surnai National Park, a neighboring reserve. It was the first clear proof that the herd had crossed into new territory naturally, using safe wildlife corridors. The bison were doing more than surviving. They were helping reconnect Romania's broken wilderness. To protect these gains, formal agreements were signed with Rewilding and Dolmogled national parks, opening up 105,000 hectares of protected land for bison and other animals. These partnerships helped create one of the largest connected wild areas in Europe, not just for bison, but for wolves, lynx, red deer, and many others. Then came something unexpected: climate impact. A Yale-led study revealed that 170 bison in just 48 square kilometers were capturing over 54,000 tons of carbon dioxide each year. That's about the same as the yearly emissions of 43,000 cars. Just by grazing and fertilizing the land, the bison were turning tired, damaged soil into healthy living carbon sinks. By the end of 2024, with the population nearing 210, the Southern Carpathians Project had reached a place no one thought possible. It had become home to the largest wild bison herd in Europe, genetically strong, ecologically important, and widely supported. What began as a last-ditch effort to save a species had turned into something far bigger, a shift in how we see the natural world. The wild didn't just return in numbers, it returned in spirit. And maybe, just maybe, that's Europe's greatest environmental miracle. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Help us spread the word and bring more people into the wild. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next video.